Colorado State University just dropped their new forecast for the 2025 hurricane season, giving us our first glimpse on how potentially active this hurricane season could be. Looking at the averages for tropical storms, so storms with winds ranging from 39 to 74 miles per hour, hurricanes, anything stronger than that threshold, anything stronger than 75 miles per hour, and major hurricanes that have a threshold of up to 111 miles per hour, or anything reaching or exceeding Category 3 strength. So the average for tropical storms in a year is 14, the average for hurricanes is 7, and the number for major hurricanes is 3. Looking at how this compares to the current forecast from Colorado State, well, they're forecasting 17 tropical storms for the new season, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. So all in all, they're forecasting higher than average amounts for all 3 categories, indicating an above average hurricane season. So there are 2 reasons why they're forecasting an above average hurricane season. The first is that they're expecting warm sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic basin. So they're expecting relatively warm, not extremely, but just enough to sway the forecast towards a potentially higher amount of activity for the season. We know that warm sea surface temperatures are crucial towards the development of hurricanes and tropical systems, and also crucial towards the strengthening, as we've seen multiple times, systems going into a warm body of water and experiencing rapid intensification. But I think just as important is the second reason, which is determining whether or not we'll be in towards an El Nino or a La Nina period. And that's really important because an El Nino indicates or corresponds towards a lower than average or a quiet hurricane season, and La Nina means higher than average or a higher amounts of activity. So they're forecasting a lack of El Nino. However, this introduces a smidge of uncertainty because we're unsure whether we'll be into a neutral pattern or towards a La Nina pattern. So going more in depth on how these global climate patterns influence our activity in the tropics. So starting off with the definition of El Nino. Well, El Nino occurs when trade winds slow down. So winds just like the jet stream in the equator, they slow down and they prevent upwelling. Upwelling occurs when the winds are strong on the surface and they kick that warm sea surface water towards the west away from the coast, allowing for water in the lower levels of the ocean to rise to the surface. That's not happening with El Nino. The Pacific will stay warm, and that will also influence circulations across the globe, which also influence the wind patterns in the Atlantic, such as faster Atlantic wind speeds. Now that's really important because the faster the wind speeds in the Atlantic is the increased amounts of wind shear. And wind shear is very detrimental towards the development of tropical systems. We know that tropical systems, they need organization. You may have noticed from satellite imagery from large-scale hurricanes that the eye wall and the eye are really organized. They have a defined wall. You can see that circulation perfectly. That's because there's nothing hindering. There's no wind shear, so they're allowing the circulation to be good, and you're allowing the warm air to truly rise and support that eye wall. But when you have wind shear, well, that supports the winds clashing together, and it causes disorganization along the eye wall and along the cloud growth. So the structure will not be as perfect as if there wasn't any wind shear. So if you have wind shear, that rips up the organization, limiting the potential for storm development and strength. So that's why with an El Nino, it corresponds towards a quiet hurricane season. But a La Nina, completely the opposite. Because the La Nina, well, the trade winds, the winds in the equator, they're actually strong, and it's enough to truly push the warm surface waters towards away from the coast and towards Asia. So that actually helps upwelling, and it causes the changes in the circulation of the winds. So because of that, we see winds being weaker in the Atlantic, and that limits the amount of wind shear that we see, causing the potential for these storms to really be high, and also increases the overall frequency of the hurricane season. So that's why when we know that we're going to be in a La Nina, it's a little bit more certain that we'll have a more active season. And that's exactly what happened last year. We knew that we were going to be in a La Nina year, and the Colorado State forecasters, they knew this too. So their forecast was a little bit more aggressive than the current forecast. So seeing what they're forecasted for tropical storms, they had 18 tropical storms, 11 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes. And they did a pretty good job with this, especially with major hurricanes. We had exactly 5 major hurricanes during our past historic hurricane season, which is the exact amount that they forecasted last year. Here are the names for this new 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. We have Andrea, Barry, Chantal, Dexter, Aaron, Fernan, Gabriel, Humberto, Imelda, Jerry, Karen, Lorenzo, Melissa, Nestor, Olga, Pablo, Rebecca, Sebastian, Tanya, Van, and Wendy. Now, there's been one change to the hurricane list as compared to when this was used back in 2019, and that's the addition of Dexter. And the reason why this change occurred is because originally it was Dorian, and Dorian was used for Hurricane Dorian, which was a Category 5 hurricane that affected the Bahamas and also impacted the Floridian coast and rode up the Atlantic seaboard, impacting more states such as South Carolina and North Carolina as well. So due to the significant damage it caused, it was retired and replaced with Dexter. But that's the only change seen with this list. Looking at the frequency of hurricanes and tropical systems for the new year and how this corresponds with the past years, we typically see storms being developed for the first couple of months of the summer. So during May and June, we see areas development. We don't see named storms. This is relatively rare, unless other than last year where we had a major hurricane for the first couple of days of July. But on average, the hurricane frequency really ramps up once we get into the later portions of July and early portions of August. And then once we get into September 10th, that's when we experience peak hurricane frequency. But after that, the only way you can go is down. So the frequency decreases in October and becomes relatively quiet by November before becoming rare in terms of development by the official end of hurricane season, which is December 1st. So other than the forecast from Colorado State, there are some other news in terms of anything related to hurricanes, and that's the official retirement of the names Helene, Beryl, and Milton. And this is really important to Central Georgia because we know Helene is still fresh on our memory, considered one of the worst storms in Central Georgia, up there with Alberto. So with this being retired, the name Helene will never be used again for any future system. And we also know that Beryl and Milton were historic in their own right. So they'll be replaced with Holly, Brianna, and Miguel, and these names will then be used for the 2030 hurricane season when their respective list will be used during that time. So going over the retired hurricane names, Helene, we know this is still fresh on our memory, but just to recap, it made landfall in the Big Bend area of Florida as a Category 4 storm. So that's when it had its peak intensity, but it raced towards Georgia and it actually entered southern portions of Georgia. So it impacted Valdosta as a Category 2 hurricane. And Central Georgia got impacted, especially our eastern half that received the dirty side of the storm. And what does that mean? They received the stronger wind gusts associated with the speed and the size of the storm. So they received gusts, so places such as Lawrence, Johnson, Washington County, Treutlen County, and Telfair County saw wind gusts of up to 100 miles per hour, seeing significant damage here in Central Georgia, stuff that we have never seen before. Continued to move northward and lost some steam, continued to weaken, and it was more of a rainmaker once it reached North Carolina. But the thing is, it caused historic flooding for North Carolina, causing catastrophic flooding during that time. So overall, we had this storm caused $78.8 billion in damage. The other storm that was retired, of course, is Hurricane Beryl. This was more historic because it just caught everyone off guard, because it was considered the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record, as it officially got that classification on July 5th. And we saw that hurricane frequency graphic. It's pretty rare to see any development, but to have a Category 5 that early was unprecedented. And it had significant impacts towards the Caribbean. That's where it had the strongest of its development. But then it weakened once it crossed the Yucatan Peninsula and entered the Bay of Campeche. But it entered Texas at a Category 1 hurricane, just south of Houston. Now, this was unfortunate for Houston because just 3 months earlier was when they experienced a strong derecho where they had winds of up to 100 miles per hour. So just 3 months after that, as they were recovering, they once again experienced hurricane force winds. So it was an unfortunate situation for Houston. And then the majority of Texas also had tornado outbreak as the outer bands from the right side clashed with winds, so the wind shear, and caused some spin-up tornadoes all across East Texas and for Louisiana and Arkansas. This hurricane caused $8.32 billion in damage. And then the last hurricane that we were mentioning, the last hurricane that's being retired, is Hurricane Milton. This was historic because it was a Category 5 hurricane in the Gulf, and it recorded the lowest pressure ever recorded, which corresponds with the strength of a hurricane. So there was a lot of uncertainty on how strong the storm will be once it makes its projected landfall into the western coast of Florida. Thankfully, and I say that with an asterisk, there was a large amount of wind shear in Florida at that time. So as we saw earlier, the forecast, wind shear really strengthened the hurricane. It caused it to be a Category 3. But the bad thing is that wind shear also caused a major tornado outbreak before landfall. So we had multiple tornadoes and strong tornadoes, such as an EF3 tornado as well. So a major outbreak that caused significant damage all across Florida. And of course, when it made landfall just south of Tampa Bay, strong wind gusts and storm surge as well, causing around $34.3 billion in damage. So that's just the recap on the retired hurricane names and the new forecast for this hurricane season. I'm meteorologist David Guerrero, 13 WAZ.